everyone. This is your host, Annie Zhang, and this is Hello Metaverse. There is a tendency to think of technology as engineering and data-driven, but the art of storytelling and the power of intuition cannot be overlooked as a central part to building great products. Where engineering brings products to life, storytelling envisions how the user will experience that product. And where data allows us to make decisions based on what we know, intuition allows us to predict outcomes based on what we sense given patterns that we observe. Especially when it comes to making innovative ideas a reality, the skill of being able to transfer these ideas to others' minds require great skill. And in this episode, we talk to Morgan Tucker, who has owned his intuition and ability to storytell, and as a result has had a long track record of being able to imagine a future reality and mobilize to bring that vision to life. A bit about Morgan: he is the current head of social products at Roblox, and previously he led design there. He is responsible for spearheading novel types of experiences on Roblox, showing both the company and the world what Roblox is capable of doing. Recently, this includes numerous entertainment experiences such as the Lil Nas X concert, the Gucci Gardens experience, and the In the Heights launch party. I am also fortunate enough to have Morgan as my manager and mentor. Previous to Roblox, he was the VP of product at envisions, where he built social avatar experiences. Given his unique background of being a creative person, having gone to art school, and operating both in design and product roles, Morgan shares his perspective on building social products and how to think about the path to creating a meaningful metaverse. As a disclosure, all opinions and points of view in this podcast are my own. It does not represent the views of Roblox, my current employer, and is not affiliated with the company. Now here is my conversation with Morgan Tucker. So Morgan, you have very, very diverse interests, and many of them is being a creative. Tell us about what your hobbies and passions are and how those experiences have lent itself to your work.
As far back as I can remember, I've been super fascinated with visceral mediums. So film, music, games, comics, things like that. And from an early age, I wanted to make all of those things. I think what I didn't really understand at the time is I just really like telling stories. And I think exploring each of those mediums has helped me become a better storyteller. And honestly, like what I do for work, it's not that different anymore. And that's pretty cool. It wasn't always that way. I've been in the technology industry for a little over 20 years, and the first decade of my career was really focused more on consumer products, hardware, software combination. But in the last decade, been really focused on metaverse concepts, virtual social interactions and things like that. And it's the perfect medium for me because it's really the confluence of all of those things. It's some of the thinking around how to create the right angles to tell the right story, or when to use sound or music to heighten mood or emotion. All of that comes to play when we're trying to create something in a spatial way in the metaverse.
So what were some of the things that you did outside of technology that focused on storytelling or visceral experiences?
Yeah, so when I was, I would say, I don't know, even 12 years old, like I volunteered to be like a key grip on an indie film, got exposed to, filmmaking early on, and made my own little cheesy things, drew my own comic books and distributed them at the local comic shop. Really became infatuated with writing and performing music. That was kind of my big passion. I actually went to school for audio production. I was dead set on becoming a record producer. That's what I thought I was born to do. Pretty shortly after getting to school, I realized this industry is not great. I love music and I love helping people realize their vision, but as an industry, not great. And so actually while I was in school, I started trying to take as many multimedia classes as I could and started steering myself towards technology. And so I actually moved from Seattle, where I was going to school, to Los Angeles to get into the record industry. Hadn't fully come to the realization that I didn't want to do it. And I got in, I recorded some bands, I did some live music, and it just didn't feel good. And at the same time, I had got this job at a startup, really just doing random things, some office management, some QA. And I found that I was actually really good at product design and development. And so they started letting me do more and more in that realm. Well, that was kind of the beginning. So all the way back in 2000, I was at a company called Blue Falcon Networks, which was peer-to-peer streaming. I built like the clients for that.
That's so cool. I didn't even know you went to school for sound editing. So clearly you didn't want to go into music. The music industry had some of its shortcomings. How would you say this way of thought, like storytelling, has been able to be incorporated in tech? Because I actually think that a lot of people in tech would say that it's pretty mechanical and very engineering driven, and there's often a lack of opportunities to express that.
I can see why people look at it that way, but the reality is ultimately when you're creating a product or telling a story, it's like you have a vision in your mind of how somebody is going to use this thing. And it's not dissimilar from imagining, a script for a movie. Like how might people use this thing? Like what are they going to be feeling when they use it? How can you improve that experience? And I think being sort of a consummate consumer myself and really interested in how these mediums can evoke emotion, evoke thought, all of that translates into imagining products. Some as simple as, again, like a streaming media player, but like some as complex as these Metaverse experiences we've been discussing.
What would you say are some of the most moving experiences or products that you've used in the past?
It can really come from anywhere. I think this is where like my career as a designer and then like moving into product, it's been like super fluid, but I recognize thoughtfulness, craftsmanship can be in something tangible or can be in software. When you start to sense the soul that's gone into something, I think that moves people on some level that they can't even really recognize at times. I'll give you an example. Like you get into a really well-made car and all the controls are laid out in exactly the right place and it just feels right. And then you stomp on the gas and it moves in the way you expect it to, or maybe even in a more exciting way. And it's emotional. And the same thing goes for, I don't know, a good cutlery or beautiful meal. Like there's artistry in everything. And I think as product designers, as product people, we should be attuned to that world around us.
That's very poetic. If people can't tell already, you clearly have a very, very strong design background. Actually, previous to being head of product for social products at Roblox, you were the head of design at Roblox and also at InView, and I'm sure many other companies prior to that as well. So can you talk a little bit more about your background in design and how that informs how you think about products and how you think about defining good product experiences?
So I love to do things that haven't been done before. And this is where, regardless of which side of the aisle I'm approaching the problem from, whether it's the design or the product side, being able to imagine that thing in some reasonable level of fidelity in your head so that you can explain it to other people and hopefully inspire them and create a nice feedback loop of collaboration and imagination is pretty critical when you're trying to do something new. And so I think the design background helps me use evocative language to visualize things.
I can personally testify to that.
Yeah. And I think ultimately, again, that's a means to an end. It's like if we're all seeing the same thing in our head, we can move much faster towards that goal that we've set out to accomplish.
And so what are some examples of products that you've really pushed for, or ways of thinking about product that you pushed for that you're really proud of?
So I'll start with IMVU, where I joined the company because there was so much raw potential in the product. It was not realized at all. Like I could see what it could be. At the time, it was like very much basically like a virtual chat room. And that's kind of what it was. And even had some sort of seedy elements to it, which I, thought twice about joining, but pushed through it. And so one of the big things that I was really excited about there was pushing that community towards creative expression and output. And the reason that made a lot of sense to me was everybody's representing themselves with these hyper realistic or like totally fantastical versions of themselves as avatars. These are aspirational selves, their how they feel today. It's inherently creative, simply just how they are presenting themselves to other users. And so could we harness that creativity and put it on display for the community to engage with, get excited about, one-up each other? And that was one of the really cool network effects. So we introduced like a really basic product, which is like you can take pictures within these spaces and share them in a photo stream, not unlike Pinterest or Instagram or whatever was going on at the time. All of a sudden you started to see like really beautiful images pop up. And it wasn't just like somebody taking our profile photo. It was like, man, they spent a lot of time framing the shot and layering and lighting. And it was all edited in real time in the engine. And when people saw these things kind of escalating in quality, like it had this ripple effect through the community. And so the quality just got better and better and better. And the creators who are making the things for the avatars were inspired to do better. And so it was a really rewarding to see, how we could set something so simple, like just being able to share your creativity in motion and the impact that had downstream. And so today, InView looks a lot different than it did when I joined. It's no longer just about chatting in a chat room. That's a component of the service, but it's really like predominantly about that creative expression and fashion sense and exploration. At Roblox, there's a lot of things, I guess. One thing that was difficult and rewarding was the first virtual concert at Roblox, the Lil Nas X concert, which had many challenges internally, both technically, but also just internal sentiment. For those that aren't familiar with it, Roblox is a platform and we don't make content. And there's a very good reason for that. We don't want to compete with our developers, who are the lifeblood of the service. It's a UGC centric platform. It would be weird if Roblox was like competing against our bread and butter. But in the same way that I was able to accomplish things at IMVU by just showing people what's possible, not dictating, but hinting or influencing. That was ultimately the name of the game with this concert. The idea was to show people internally and the world externally that our platform was capable of evolving past this perception of a children's gaming platform and into something that could be compelling for people of any age, that could have a social experience, not necessarily a game with like rules or competition, but rather something that you engage with your friends and just immerse yourself in the content and the emotionality of the music. And I think we pulled it off. Like it was rough. It was hard. Like the platform wasn't built to do it. And we pushed the limits of what was capable at the time, but it set something really awesome in motion. And all of a sudden people are talking about Roblox in a different way. And I think our creator community also seeing like the potential of what could be accomplished here. And so I think it's still early days. We're still just starting to see the beginning of the ripples of that project, but really proud of being able to kind of pull that off within this company.
Yeah, and just witnessing that entire process from the sidelines, it was an impressive feat to really pull off. As people can probably tell already, you have very strong intuition, and if you were to be put into almost a PM archetype, you're very strong on the vision side. And the way that you perceive and pitch things is in a very visceral and experiential way, which can trip a lot of people up. I mean, personally, I really resonate with that, but coming from a company like Facebook, for example, where it's very data driven, it's very much about needing to prove with numbers and data and market analysis and stuff. How would you describe your process and really owning in on that intuition process? And for someone who clearly don't think about things in that way, how would you articulate why it's actually important to lean in this?
So there's many layers here. I think intuition is ultimately pattern recognition. And, you and I have had this conversation before. It's being able to identify the hint of something and then kind of jump 3 steps ahead to what that thing may become or could become. And I think you feed pattern recognition with, information. And so I think, again, I go back to the statement that like I'm a consummate consumer of all things, whether that's written media or podcasts or film or games or music. I'm constantly absorbing. It's why I live in San Francisco. I want to be stimulated by my surroundings. I want to make connections maybe that I wouldn't if I were in more of a routine. And so I think living a more open-ended and fluid life in that way actually helps stimulate that. So I think perpetually I am seeking more information. I want to fill that cup up and have it overflow, because that gives me an ability to correlate like something somebody is saying in this conversation with something I saw yesterday or even like 10 years ago. And what I'm really happy about is that in my career now, all these things that were seemingly random and not connected, my love of film, my love of music, all this, like it's all like come to a head in this thing we're calling the metaverse that is leveraging all of these mediums to great effect. And so my feeling on what a great film looks like or what an emotional experience is tied together there. So I think that's part of it. And now I've forgotten the first part of your question.
Yeah, I think it's just how can you explain to someone who's skeptical about that process why it works? And also, if somebody doesn't really know how to own into intuition, what are some basic steps to help them go about it? Because I think this is really important in building software for the future. I think we're getting to a pretty mechanical phase right now. And especially if we're thinking about 3D immersive experiences, there has to be so many things that are emotion driven and the details do matter.
So I think there are two paths, I think, in technology. Like one is on optimization and the other is on creation. Thankfully, we're in an industry where like either are very vital and valid. And I certainly bias towards the creation part. I think that you have to get comfortable with taking a risk, being wrong. Though I like to claim that I have a pretty good track record about guessing things.
I can attest.
I'm wrong at times. I think it's really dangerous when you get older and out of touch, I think, with like a younger generation to assume you know what's best based on your own experience, because your experience doesn't match a predominant percentage of the world at this point. And so I think you have to be constantly open to being wrong or to having your intuition propped up by the perspective of others. I always look at these crazy pitches as like an opportunity to prove to myself that what I'm saying actually is right. If people get it and they're like, I kind of, and then they like say like, you mean like this? And sometimes I didn't mean like this, but they said something that I was like, oh yeah, I totally meant like that. And then I build the narrative from there and it becomes a little bit more of a fluid vision. So yeah, I think you have to be comfortable with not knowing all the answers, but taking a chance and saying like, maybe it's this, and then verbalizing that, testing your hypotheses as quickly as possible, failing fast, building off of that. What that looks like for me in practice is just talking with people. What parts do they react to? What parts do they not understand? Sometimes I go so far into esoterica that I lose people. And so I know now I need to like pull that back because I haven't developed that concept firmly enough to be able to communicate it well. It's really being open to evolution. Like there's no like pure vision and like you just work towards that. It's something that evolves over time and it's fed by the people in the world around you.
That's really well put. Just for people who are also dreamers or idealists or people who are extremely creative but might not really have the leverage or influence in an organization to go for something ambitious. I mean, clearly you've gone through that many, many times to be where you are today. But how do you build credibility? Or what are some of the tactics that you've utilized to make sure that people who are extreme doubters over time are no longer doubters? Or is it just sheer force? Because I've seen that before too.
It can be many things. Sometimes it is being just headstrong and plowing through it. But I think ultimately you have to put your money where your mouth is. It's like not good enough to just be an idea person. Everybody's got ideas.
Right.
And so you have to be able to connect the dots on execution. And I think that's actually where the art comes in. There's a lot of dreamers out there that are not able to like walk back from something crazy and say like, okay, but here is actually the V0. Here is the thing that starts to get us some learning or inkling of whether or not we're on the right track. And so as we've worked together, we've done things where we imagine these big, crazy futures where people are connecting in ways that we can't even conceive of right now that are bound by technology. But we're like, hey, like, wouldn't it be great if you could just like control the rate at which you're emoting, you're clapping, and like that in and of itself is like an important signal to the person. Like, are you really excited or are you just kind of like, is it like a languid thing? And that gives us clues as to whether or not we're on the right track. Are people using that? Do they even figure it out? Is it having any downstream impact? Do we like it? Do we find it fun? That's the biggest thing, is like to build credibility. You have to marry the vision with an ability to execute. When you're trying to convince people, you're going to have to make do with what you've got. And this is where the design background comes in. Like, if you're able to create wireframes or mock-ups, or even show examples that get your point across that come from some other medium, again, like a comic book or a movie or a video game. It's like, hey, it's like this, but like imagine this twisted. Like, so you don't have to be a designer yourself. You can point to other prior art to help you make your point. But the more you can get people seeing the same thing in their head that you do, and they believe that it's possible to make it, the more you build up a groundswell of support.
Yeah, I love that. Well, let's zoom out a little bit. So enough about how to build product, but what is happening within the industry. So we're both at Roblox right now. We're kind of in the intersection of gaming and then also kind of social because we are the social team. And so I'd be curious to think about how you're witnessing this convergence of maybe two industries, or just in general, how are you seeing this phenomenon and what's happening right now?
Yeah, I think there's many good and bad things about both sides of those things. But I think married with one another, they actually create a holistic perspective on where we're going, I think, in this space, specifically like the metaverse space. Gaming has the fidelity, rendering has improved so greatly. In the last 10 years, things look very realistic. You can truly immerse yourself in an experience. The audio is like amazing. Visuals are amazing. But I think they're still, by and large, highly curated experiences. And the difference between a social network or a social product and maybe like a gaming product is that the other things are less curated, at least by the network. They're UGC effectively. And so there's that open-endedness and that surprise that you're going to get from a user-generated community versus something where somebody who's very talented and very skilled has imagined, this is how I want somebody to experience this thing. And so marrying those two things together is, I think, our duty moving forward. It's taking some of the best things about gaming that are good approximations for representing yourself digitally, like it feels right to jump at this moment or to touch this button in this way, to have your character do that thing, with this open-endedness, with this perspective that like actually we as the platform or the creators don't know what people are going to do with this exactly. Like we might have an idea and we kind of want to nudge them in the direction, but we want to be surprised by what they do with this. And so we're in the business, I think, of making tools and empowering people to imagine outcomes rather than dictating. And I think that's maybe the difference between gaming and social. And it's the intersection of those two things I think we've started to really see the power of these days.
Wow, that's a great way of looking at it. I think that just totally shifted my perspective, because I do think there's not necessarily a dogmatic way of going about things in gaming, but it's a really intense industry, right? And I think one reason for why it's a little bit isolating to mass market is that people are just really hardcore, right? They're very immersed in these worlds. I think they're also very particular about some mechanics and how things work. Meanwhile, social products are free and expressive.
Yeah, and there are things, like at least conceptually, that social products have done really well. And so like you use the word gaming or gamer, that label is polarizing, right? Like I'll bet there are more people who don't identify as a gamer than there are who do. And so if you're creating a product for gamers, like you're eliminating like a big percentage of the population. And so what I mean by like some concepts that social's gotten right, like Instagram basically said like, hey, we know it's like scary to be like a professional photographer, but we're going to make it really easy for you to feel like a creative. And they don't use the word creator because that, again, that word, that label is intimidating to people. But that's what people are doing. They're creating every day, and they're upping their own creative vision and skill as they use that product. So I think that's something that we have to think about moving forward. If we're really trying to make products for the world, for everyone, we have to be careful not to label, not to intimidate, not to polarize the audience, and really ensure that like the language we're using and the mechanisms for input we're using are open and friendly to everyone.
Definitely. And speaking of Instagram and how easy it was to become a creator and to participate in this ecosystem, I think with most mainstream social apps, they are still 2D, right? It's still very flat. It's an app. It's even now TikTok, the most popular social platform, one would argue, is still flat, except it's video content. How would you think about bringing social into the metaverse in this 3D layer? I think there's definitely much more complexities than just turning a Zoom call into a 3D hangout. So how do you think about that?
The way I like to think about this is we as human beings, we're spatial creatures, like we're bioengineered to operate within 3D space. We understand that more than we do 2D. So if you go back in time to when people were using software and didn't really get how things function, we had like this heavy round of skeuomorphism. So people understood like that's a button that I press and it depresses when I click it. That is a knob that I turn because that's something that I know how to operate spatially. We've like advanced way beyond that at this point, everybody's got a computer in their pocket. They understand the metaphors and paradigms of interaction, but we're still spatial creatures. And I think it's much more natural to parse the world around you in that manner. And so I actually don't think you have to think too hard about it. You start with foundation of reality, but then that layers in the next opportunity, which is it would be boring if this metaverse that we want to have come to life was just a pale imitation of reality. Like the opportunity is to go back to, something Steve Jobs said a long time ago. It's like the computer is a bicycle of the mind. It's a tool to make you superhuman, to do things you couldn't do in reality. And so if we think about, how could we make this conversation more compelling? How could you really get what's in my head? Like, do we have the ability to, using either manually inputted tools or AI assisted, visualizations, can you see what I'm saying in a way? Can I convey emotion and nuance in a digital form where the lighting of the room changes to really like add dramatic flair and effect to what I'm trying to say? Or as I speak words, they turn manifest into objects that you're like, oh, okay, that's what he meant, not that other thing. There's so many opportunities to layer basically the ability to control reality into these things that we do naturally to make us superhuman in our ability to communicate, to imagine, to collaborate. And so that's the way I like to think about things.
Wow, I'm sure people's eyes are just lighting up from the idea of that. It sounds super exciting, but I do have to ask, so the utility of, a Facebook app or a Messenger app or just scrolling on our phone and being on this mindless feed it's really easy to use. So there's clearly barriers to onboarding people and getting people into the habit of going into more 3D experiences. So how do you think about things to transition people into that or ways to help build that habit?
This is where you have to be, as a designer, you want to make sure that you're doing right by your consumer. You're not forcing them into a paradigm that's actually worse. And there are certainly times where like parsing, a list of text is like much more efficient than like navigating it in space. And so like, let's go back to like some of the things that people got wrong in the 90s about VR when they thought like, okay, like VR is coming, it's going to be a big thing. And shopping in the future is going to be this big 3D mall. And I'm going to go to the record store and I'm going to finger through like the CDs in the store and pull them up. And it's like, that's so inefficient when I could just type, the thing I want into a Google search bar and get the thing immediately. So again, it's all about marrying those two things and being conscious of in what context is spatial better than a flat or 2D interface. But I think there's an ability to connect those two things. Right now, they're wholly disconnected. You could almost imagine like a toggle that's like, hey, I'm on the move. I'm on my phone. I don't have time to like sit down and like, jack into the virtual reality. I just want a quick read on what's going on in this room. And then it's like, hey, I got to my destination. I've got some time. I can really like get into it and like absorb the emotionality. And so like, can we create systems that are able to toggle back and forth between a more informational view and then a more, visual view? I think the answer is yes. And so I think like to look at hints of where this is coming from, there's a lot of work that's been done in the AR space to add layers of information to reality. I think that's actually a good place to investigate.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point where instead of thinking about it as 2D or 3D, it's almost a different dimension all in itself, right? Yep. It's way better than what's in real life, or its capabilities are far greater. Another thing I want to ask you about is just from a practical standpoint of being a product designer or a product manager and now trying to build these metaverse-like experiences, there are certain considerations or roles or even parts of the process that people don't realize are important. So for example, when I joined Roblox, I didn't realize there was such a big role of 3D design and 3D art and that being plugged into everything that you do. So what are some of those things that you just think people should know about if they're trying to build products within the metaverse sphere?
Today, the metaverse is built using a lot of the principles of game design. And so if you want to understand like all of the functions that need to exist to build a great metaverse experience, and you're going to look at, a game studio and the artists, the producers, all of that. I think it's all really important. Level design, really important, like because people are thinking spatially about how the user is navigating through the experience and like what's going to happen at what point. And then you need to fuse that with like more traditional product thinking.
Switching gears, what are some trends that you're noticing from younger generations, whether it's Gen Z, Gen Alpha, in how they interact with technology, how they socialize with technology, and then any other phenomenon that you're catching on to?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be hard for me to say anything here that hasn't been said before, probably better. But here's what I notice. I think this generation, the younger generation, craves authenticity because they've grown up in an environment where everything is highly editorialized, like whether it's television or internet or whatever, games. I think it's suffocating because they don't have the same kind of like open-ended freedom maybe that generations before did, when it was like okay to just like go out in the world until it was time for dinner. When you think about like what does authenticity mean in the digital realm, to them, they look for things that read human, things that are imperfect. It's why they would much rather watch a YouTube celebrity make soup than go see a Hollywood movie. And I know that sounds like facetious, but I actually think Roblox is a really good example of what reads as human and digital because it's imperfect. You can tell that a human made that thing because it's weird. It doesn't work perfectly. You're trying to figure out exactly what they're trying to say or what the intent was. That imperfection is something that's counterintuitive from a design side. It's like you would assume users want things that are like flawlessly executed and polished. And it's like, no, actually like it feels cold and like machine-like to go too far in that direction. And so I think even as the rendering capabilities and fidelity, et cetera, get better for all of these platforms, you want to make sure that you hang on to that humanness, that imperfection. One other trend with the youth that's interesting is that they, again, crave the ability to be their authentic self, but they know that they can't be all the time. And so they create, Rinstas and Finstas. It's really odd to like imagine that there's a generation that has that fine-grained understanding of the masks we present, societally. Like we all do it, like without even thinking about it. I'm going to act differently talking to you than I would with my brother or with my boss at work. That like very delineated perspective on the aspects of your personality and how you're presenting yourself. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but it's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, building off of that point too, do you think that the metaverse essentially presents a way for people to explore that a bit further? But also, I'm curious, do you think that's positive or negative?
I think it's really positive, and I've seen it in action, especially at IMVU. And so I'll give you some examples. It's like I'm a little bit more mature platform than Roblox, at least content-wise. And we had a lot of people who were experimenting with their sexuality. They didn't know, who they were. They're teenagers. They're trying to figure things out. They can do it in a safe space because people don't know who they are. They're anonymous, and they can try things on, try on new skin, try on new personalities without any danger of incriminating themselves in the real world. And so I think that's really powerful. That actually leads me to like one of my big crazy concepts that I think we have the potential to realize at some point, which is the ability to quite literally walk in someone else's shoes. And I think if we want to achieve world peace and understanding, like people need greater context, they need greater empathy. And these platforms actually allow you to put yourself into the perspective of your fellow man or woman in ways that you just can't otherwise. I think that raw power of literally being able to live from that perspective works in really interesting ways.
Definitely. Well, I have one last question. I think people already know hints of this, but what is your ideal metaverse?
Yeah, I mean, I think the metaverse is owned by the people. Like that's the vision that's compelling. When we get to a point where it's very easy for anybody to make in 3D space the way that they can today, like take a photo on Instagram and make it artful or shoot a great TikTok short and be funny. What is the 3D equivalent of that? We're going to get there hopefully sooner than later. And I'm really excited by like the raw power and potential of the voices of people who currently don't have a foothold in the industry. Like they're going to come at it completely differently, than any way we can imagine. And that's to me the most exciting thing. You want to be surprised, and you will be. The metaverse that I envision, that I want to see happen, is something that is totally democratized, that is owned by the people, and can be anything that they imagine.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Morgan, for chatting with me. Always eye-opening.
Thank you.
That was Morgan Tucker, Head of Social Products at Roblox. If you're curious about some of the new experiences we've been experimenting with at Roblox, come check out our new Aloe Yoga Wellness Sanctuary on the platform. It's in conjunction with New York Fashion Week, and we are hoping to bring a perspective of wellness in the metaverse to the fashion conversation. and it's launching today. Huge shout out to Elena Moss, who is a product manager on my team, who helped produce this episode. If you like this episode, please help leave a review on your podcast app of choice. As always, thank you for listening. This is your host, Annie Zhang, and I will see you in 2 weeks.